Okay, so welcome everybody. We're a couple of minutes past the hour, so let's kind of dive in. I'm gonna we'll stop this. I'll sort of stop this cover photo sharing, and we just kind of jump into conversation. So thanks everybody for coming. We're I'm not sure that the chat works. We do have a Q&A that works. So if you have questions, just drop something in the Q&A, and we will sort of call it out, or we'll talk about whatever you have to say. It's a kind of small group today, which is actually good because I think we're going to have a more sort of in-depth conversation, and deep dives are always kind of more fun with like a 25, 30, 40 folks than maybe a larger audience. So I think everyone's probably come here sort of because they're interested in performance for some reason, and for like some aspect of performance. And we're going to kind of dive into a lot of different sort of parts of performance, as well as like, just other parts of site optimization in terms of the context of this particular project that Kevin worked on. But before, I think, just to give kind of a picture of the whole thing, we're going to kind of give a little bit of, we're going to sort of go into some background before we like dive right into the project, and then, talk about kind of both some of the business aspects, as well as like, some of the technical aspects, and, and UI UX design as well. But maybe kind of before that, and, just before, I want to introduce Kevin a little bit as well, but before that, like, do you want to just like, maybe do you want to introduce yourself and just like talk a little bit about the results first before we get into all the background and the project just a bit?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Great to be here. Yeah, this was a fun project. So I first got it into meeting them early last year, and we really didn't know what the results would be. And so just, the way I kind of love thinking about the project first is the results. And because those are the most surprising. Because we came into this thinking, okay, let's make things fast, let's make things easy to use, and maybe we'll double the amount of leads, or maybe we'll increase conversion by 25%. And just some recent stats from the past month or so, we see, like more than a 7 times increase in number of pages per visitor on the site from mobile paid traffic versus the other 19 sites they operate. And so that was very interesting. And then it turned into a conversion rate that is anywhere from 6 to 9 times higher. And we can probably go into how we figured that out, which is like, again, weren't really expecting that. And the other thing that was another surprising stat from a business standpoint is that the lead volume overall is higher, in some cases like 9 to 10 times higher than it was prior to the site launch, like this new site launching. So volume is up, the conversion rate is up, and then also the close rate on leads that come from this site versus the other ones is also higher. It was 53% higher close rate on leads that come through the site versus their other ones. And so
I want to just kind of stop you right there and say, like,
super cool.
I think because it's amazing. I mean, these are like sort of amazing results, and I wanted to, we wanted to kind of just tease right at sort of at the beginning, as everyone was coming in, like, why are we kind of like diving specifically into this example? It's because the results were kind of so incredible, and we want to kind of walk through like, okay, like sort of like the step-by-step that Kevin did to kind of get the results. And I think I think in the emails and sort of in the landing page, I think, we kind of, Kevin's a performance expert, but also, in some ways like a mad scientist. I think he goes farther than most folks would go, in terms of like optimizing. It's like relentless optimization, and like to sort of like get that sense of strategy. So let's just start kind of from the beginning, Kevin. So like, how did you get into tech in the first place? And can you just share a bit about your background?
Yeah, well, you wouldn't be the first to call me a mad scientist. So that's probably an accurate depiction, and probably most things in life. So yeah, I think this fascination on with like building stuff it came from well, my parents were teachers, and so growing up, we had a Mac computer and had no games,
Uh-huh.
and because it was like it was you'd use this for school and that was it, and so my older brother and I were like, okay, well, we got nothing to play with, so might as well code because there was basically your options were like a writing app or AppleScript, and so I got into coding pretty young, around 7, and around that time I made my first website, and it was an embroidery company for one of my classmates' dad, who ran this like monogram shirt company. So that's kind of how I got into web design and got a bike out of it. So it's like, huh, website equals bike. Okay, this is interesting. So I kind of got into web really, for a number of years. Did that for about 15 years. Ran a few agencies, and then I got into the SaaS world. I thought, oh, I'll try something else. So built up a company, a Stafflo, which sells kind of like messaging solutions to wireless carriers and banks and financial institutions and insurance companies, et cetera. So like worked in high compliance, worked in like big enterprise, and
Yep.
so that experience kind of informed. I realized that a lot of the stuff that people would send over text was kind of a mediocre experience. Like they weren't fast, they weren't really
Yeah.
accessible. So that kind of when I retired from there, I was like, oh, I really want to solve that. I really want to make something fast and really nice for people to use on their phone. And so that brought me back into into kind of modern edge web. So I've been working with Gatsby for almost 5 years now.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I think for me, it's like I think I'm just fascinated with the engineering of it and like trying to
Uh-huh.
really understand, like have empathy for the user, but also the device, which sounds weird, but like, how do you
Yeah.
make something that doesn't just like suck all the memory and take forever to load?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, we think there's been a bit of a gap between sort of the mobile web and the native apps for a while, and people have been asking, what causes it, why does stuff that like works really well and seamlessly on native apps not work as well on the mobile web, which is a whole nother conversation. Maybe we do another webinar on that topic sometime.
Yeah.
But like I'm also kind of like fascinated by that, because I think it's just one of the biggest questions of the web is how we make it work, how we sort of equalize the experience on mobile, which is where, most traffic is these days.
Right.
Can you, so what, can you talk maybe a bit about some of the previous work that you've done with Gatsby, and then sort of like maybe how this project with Coons started?
Yeah. So previously, the projects that I would do in Gatsby were in different industries. So again, like telecom, high
Hmm.
compliance. And I also saw the value with certain projects on and just the speed at which it can move up the search ranking, like we
Hmm.
saw with Wave Direct. I think there was an
Yeah.
article about that, but
Yeah.
so that
931
that so that,
SEO increase or something like that is
yeah,
the
it was
stat I
just
remember.
it was just crazy to see that, and yeah, so that's like there's a bunch of prior work, but most of my stuff I do under NDA, so I don't really talk about it much. But I
Mhm.
will say, like with this was kind of this was a different type of project, because for me, I generally like hard stuff, and so this was super hard because there's a lot of variables to it, and no one had really done it before in auto to this level of performance before, and so like that attracted me to it, and then yeah, I got to meet the Coons folks through an online community where I was chatting with their marketing director just on other stuff like data and stuff, and then it just so happened that as the more we talked about it, that's when I started looking at their existing sites, and I was like, oh, we got to solve this. We got to fix this performance. And the questions were like, why? Like, I don't know. This is what you get like with the existing solutions that are out there. Like, why does performance matter? And
Mhm.
so this was definitely new for them and new for me as like someone trying to advise someone, like how do you explain without proof of somebody doing it before, how do you explain that this stuff works, right?
Mhm. That's it.
And
Yeah.
it was super
I,
scary for them.
so I mean, I think community is really interesting. Like you know, you kind of you started with them thinking about the problem rather than the solution. Um, what kinds of things were they sort of like hoping for or whatever at the beginning of the project?
uh they I think we all kind of didn't know actually. I would say that at the beginning though, the one thing that was what I appreciated about them, uh there's a lot of things, but one thing that really stood
And
out
then
is
sorry,
they're like it.
also can you just introduce a little bit who coons are as well? Like,
Yeah, I was about to get to that. I was going to get to that. No, they're just like they're a just over $3 billion business. They have over 3,000 employees and very efficiently run. I'm typically used to working on stuff with 50,000 employees, but so this was like a bit of a smaller project than I'm used
mhm,
to. But I really liked is their tenacity of or their focus on like on customers, like just like they're just relentless on how do you like create this great experience that's proactive and surprising, and also they have a very high performance culture internally on just tracking various metrics. So going back to your question of like what was some of the expectations, they just said like, is it going to sell more cars? Right? It's like sounds
mhm.
great, but is it going to like make a better experience? Is it going to sell more vehicles? And so
Yeah,
right away we actually put that in our you know agreement of like building this out was there's a goal of here's what we want to achieve, which is basically a doubling of leads was kind of the original goal.
yeah.
And because we can't control the close rate, so we just basically made the metric based on, all right, we're going to double the leads, and then obviously
Yeah.
did more than that, but that was like the single main objective, and that helped focus the project for sure.
Your sort of North Star metric.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
um but
Where,
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
where'd you start? I mean, yeah.
uh oh yeah, like you mean like in terms of like
And like,
how
how did the project start? What were the first things that you did?
uh oh, that's a good question. I think, well, first it was like it was understanding them, right? So number one is just get a map of kind of what's the current state. So it was a bunch of time going down to see them in person. And then what we then did is start to install rudder stack right away into their existing
Mhm.
stuff. And
Yeah.
so I felt that was really important to get a baseline so we knew what was achievable. And with that, then we also started to get a, an example of their scorecard of like how do they score themselves, how do they score the performance of a site, so that way we're talking the same language.
Mhm.
And so that was like the first thing. And then once we had that clear, then we said, okay, here's what we should do based on what those stats show. And then the other thing that we did, I think actually I didn't remember this now, is we did like a proof of tech, because I actually didn't know that this would work in auto. I knew I wanted it to work, but I first had to figure out, could I even like take inventory data that's super messy, and can I do it right? So we did that first before we really scoped out the project. It was just like, let's test that this stuff actually connects, and it did. So I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, those are like some of the early things we did just to make sure that it would answer those questions that came up of like, it's never been done before. How do we know this will work? And how we know if it's successful. So that was like the tactic up front anyway.
Yeah, and for those who are sort of not familiar with it, RudderStack's called the CDP, which basically stores data on kind of per visitor or per person basis for and makes it sort of easy to see like the sequence of events that a person did.
Yeah, so
Oh.
actually on that point, I just touch on that because it is important of like how we came to the conclusions we did.
Mhm.
Um, the rudder stack, yeah, installing it and having it go into a warehouse, Postgres warehouse is what we used, but it allowed us to do a couple things. First, just to understand the baseline of overall stats, but the other
Mhm.
tactic was once we knew that leads were converting, because in auto at least, it's the existing solutions. They do a really good job actually of making things trackable. So based on the page path, you can know whether something converted or not always.
Mhm.
And so I was able to use that and go, okay, let's look at the journey of like uh, random leads that did convert and see what did they do. And we found a
Mhm.
pattern. We found that they typically went to 4 or more pages.
Mhm.
And so that for me was actually that became my North Star metric, right? Which is like, if we need to get leads and like 90 something percent of leads went to 4 or more pages, my job is to make sure first that they're human, that they're in the right
Right. Yep.
area, and third that let's get them to go to more pages.
Yep. Yeah. Can you share the just the Coons homepage so I think people can just like
Yeah,
take a look at it?
and
I mean,
there's
I
so many.
sort of a ton
There's
more questions, but I think they're probably better against something you can see.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's some cool stuff. There's some
yeah,
cool
yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah. And so,
Uh,
so you had a stat that we were talking about kind of beforehand with like, that 4 more pages. And why is that important in auto?
uh, I mean, well, I mean, I don't know the exact answer, but I think I have a hunch, right? Which is that
Mhm.
if if they don't go to 4 of my pages, if they only go to 1 page, right? That's basically like a bounce. That means usually they just said, you know what, forget this. I'm just going to call,
Yeah.
and they just leave, right?
Hmm.
And so um, going to multiple pages shows depth, right? It shows intent. It shows that they're. In our case, it actually didn't matter too much what pages. What I found is it didn't actually matter what pages it was. It
Hmm.
was more just that they went to 4 or more. And
Interesting.
um, I think also that leads into why the close rate is higher, is because by the time that they end up interacting with people, they already have a sense of the brand a bit because they went deeper, right?
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of
No, no, I think that does. Yeah, and you also said something really interesting. We sort of promised a performance deep dive, and what we didn't tell you is that we're actually not just deep diving into performance, but we're kind of deep diving into like UX and like optimal figuring out the optimal visitor flow and sort of a lot of things that are also like performance, like really interesting sort of topics and related to conversion. And performance stuff is coming up though if you're sort of like really interested in that. So hang
so
tight if that's your thing. And okay, so let's kind of I think you said another quote when we were chatting earlier, which is, your goal is to get them off the homepage into another thing. And I just really loved that quote. And I'm probably saying it wrong, but like, can you kind of talk a little bit about why you want to get them off the homepage and onto another page?
yeah, I could, well, I did want to show something first, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I think this is my ADHD. It's like literally, where it's like if I have a thought, I want to say it. No,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I'll come back. I'll come back to the.
Okay, I'll bring
Good
us back
question.
here.
But no, but good question. Yeah, I guess going back to like if because the goal is discovery and more pages, and we know that on the homepage is not going to be a place that you convert. Like typically, at least in auto, um, a homepage is where a lot of people convert because they look like this, right? Or because they go to the page, they go to the homepage, and there's all these things that pop up right on top of it, and there's like buttons and like lead forms and like call us now. So then the homepage, is that's why a lot of the that's why a lot of folks just kind of abandon it. Um, but what we wanted to do was get them off the homepage. We didn't want to try and make the homepage the conversion place, because then you've got a really superficial lead, right? You've got somebody that didn't really go very deep. It's just like, give me, here's my name and phone number, call me, and then they just left, right? Like kind of a sucky lead. So I
Love it.
so yeah, so our job was to not convert them on the homepage. It's to get them to discover. So we want, and the other thing that another thing we did, just going back to like stuff that we did at the beginning, is we through RudderStack, we installed also Microsoft Clarity, and that allowed us to see, behavior of how people were shopping on their current sites. And what we noticed is that people really only scrolled 25% down. So that's like on a phone, they go to it and then just, scroll once or twice and that's it. And so again, that tells me the homepage's job is really to be a portal, right? It's like, let them get to where they want to go, which is typically if the goal is leads on cars, let's get them to the cars. So that was like, why?
I think this is like super fascinating. So do you want to sort of like intro the perf sort of chart that you're bringing up? And I'm going to go turn off my HVAC system.
Sounds good. This was kind of interesting. So going back to like performance, I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, the timeline view in Safari, but this actually helped us educate the client too about what's happening. Because again, when you go back into like explaining why performance matters, I basically opened up this and said, look, this is one of your current sites, right? And this experience, this is actually on desktop. This isn't even on mobile. Like some of these things take, 15, 17, 19 seconds to load. And on mobile, it's like sometimes 40 seconds. And no one's really kind of brought that up in conversation, and it kind of as an industry, right, of why that's not a good idea. And so by using kind of this tactic, it was kind of showing, look, you're making the person's phone or computer do all this work, right? Like these are it has to phone home, it has to talk to APIs, it has to re-render. So like all this is just like bloat and really hard on the machine, and that burns battery life faster, et cetera, et cetera. And you look in comparison, this is Coons, right? Where over the same, time horizon, actually, if I kind of like imitate the exact same time horizon here, that's your direct comparison, right? And you can see the difference, like almost no network requests. And really those network requests are just images in our case, because we typically don't do any, except for like search. So but getting to this spot was hard, right? Like we had to be very intentional as to what we put into the site, what libraries, and even still, I'm actually not entirely like yes, this is good, but you can do better. I found there's a way to make this actually 80% faster, which is our next version. but to get to this is, it was just like this relentless pursuit of, you can't just pick Gatsby, right? First, you have to be, constantly upgrade to like the latest, ideally, right? Don't build on Gatsby 2 or something. Build on the new stuff. And then we also learned that it matters what you put into it, right? Like Gatsby will do some of the work, but not all of the work. Like if you put garbage into it, then you can't be surprised that the page speed is so slow. And so we had to be relentless at like what we put in, which was expensive, right? For us to basically do that R&D work and figure out, all right, what's the right combo of libraries.
Let's dive into some of those. Like, I think that those are some of sort of the performance work that you did on some of the various components of the site is just one of the most interesting sort of like parts of the project. Where do you want to go first?
Oh, so many. Okay. So I think the first thing was, we knew we wanted to have like a search component. We knew we wanted, certain elements, but what we found is if you put like the default Algolia library or the default, TypeScript, they just add like sometimes 300, 400 kilobits of load to the page, right?
Yep.
So just one library could bring its, all the stuff over. So we're not solving the problem. So we actually had to build a lot of so in some cases we had to build our own. In some cases, Actually, in a lot of cases, we had to make our own components and use because we wanted to do as much as possible inside Cloudflare in the edge.
Mhm.
And so, which there are not a lot of libraries for of like how to do it, right? So that was kind of one thing is we wanted to take as much of the site out of the actual page as possible and put that on the edge. So for example, just like showing an example, it's like something cool, but also an example of like something we had to do is the site, like you kind of look at it and you think, okay, yeah, it's like, you know, yeah, it's fast, but nothing special. But what's cool about it is that it has a whole bunch of modes to it. So for example, this is kind of home mode, and you'll notice that the navigation is kind of alive, in that it dynamically changes based on where you go. So if I go into a vehicle, um,
Mhm.
okay, this is like desktop mode, right? But let's go into like mobile,
Yeah.
because that's where most visitors are. So that's actually who I care about. So that was another thing about relentless pursuit was desktop literally was after mobile, like, which was really hard to do because we're wired to test stuff on desktop, and
Yep.
clients are wired to think that way.
I mean,
And
that's where we develop, right? So why shouldn't we just, just test in the environment we develop it,
but
right?
but our customers are not doing that, right? Like no one is wired into a
Exactly.
desktop. They're on the train, they're on their phone and with a 3G connection sometimes. So
Yeah.
um and the more that I travel around the US, it's giving me empathy for like sometimes just the networks suck, right? Not it's no one's fault, but it's just things happen, weather, whatever, and that's the reality, right? So you have to like design for that, not design for what we have in our perfect, setup with 4 monitors or whatever. And so anyway, going back to like mobile, so you see the top bar, there's like, yeah, this is like home mode because there's no back button, right? And then as I
Mhm.
go into, this was a deliberate decision as well to not have branding on the top,
Mhm.
which was difficult to explain why, but again, the goal was leads, right? So if you
Mhm.
already know who it is, like why reinforce it? So that's why we make this feel more like an app at the top here where there's a back button. So it's no, but this to build that component, so it has these different modes of like home mode, interior page. You also like on a because I'm on the search page, that you have the search at the top. But then if I go into one of these other places, you'll notice there's no search bar at the top. So there's like home mode,
Mhm.
search view with search, and then there's also landing page mode, which is this. And so if there's a UTM parameter provided to various pages on the site, um, the top navigation actually automatically disables the navigation menu. And
Interesting.
so it's important. I kind of took that from Amazon, where if you notice as you get into the funnel,
Mhm.
um, to convert, like if you're like doing in the checkout, they remove everything else, right? You're now in
Mhm.
checkout mode, and it's really just to prevent people getting lost or distracted. And
Yeah.
so, and you can see here, right? The reason why this doesn't have a nav bar is because of the UTM parameter. And so
Yeah.
if I take that out, um, well, it's
Interesting.
actually just remembered that I'm on the campaign actually, so it saved it. But normally, if you go to a certain page, like this would the nav bar would not look like this, right? It would be
Mhm.
more like this. So number one was like we had this vision of this dynamic nav that had these different modes, and then I didn't want it to flicker. I didn't want it to re-render. So that was tough, right? To kind of
Yeah.
figure that out. And then the other thing that we had to so I learned that we couldn't use a lot of the off the shelf things, also because of this. The other kind of main thing that was important is like what I kind of one of our goals on the touchless side is like to make sure that people with autism and disabilities can use the web, which most sites are actually not very accessible. And so with this, just to make sure that the nav works really well, with keyboard mode, and to be able to even like open up a menu and go through the options and
Yeah.
like completely control it with a keyboard, that was also difficult because a lot of what we started with is we'd pick libraries, different libraries. It doesn't mean that they talk to each other, right? And so they don't know each other's state. And so that, again, just so something as simple as like nav, we found that we had to do our own component. The other one, I'll just not to belabor this point too much, but the other one was like photo galleries.
Yeah.
Like making sure that photo galleries were performant. We tried so many different ones. And I think what I'll do is when this gets posted, I'll provide references to the libraries we ended up choosing, just so folks can know, for those who care about it. So photo galleries was a big thing, and then the other one was calendars, like just a calendar picker. We wanted it to be accessible, work with screen readers, and work really great on desktop and mobile. And we tried 21 different ones. So we go down, install it. We're like, oh, this looks really great. And then every time we install a component, we do a bundle check using the inspector. And then we would look at the page speed score. And if it dropped in any way, like the score, we took it out and we said, okay, start again. We got to keep going and try another one. And so going back to like, mad scientist, relentless pursuit, it was like, we even though we found something that we liked, we didn't like stop. We're like, great, we'll put that in the pile, but let's keep going and try all the rest anyway. Right.
Yeah.
And
can you talk a bit about your user testing?
Oh yeah. Then the other part of this was just testing the real world. Right. Now we built this kind of during the lockdown, right? In Toronto was like in kind of like super lockdown at the time. And so it's not like you could go to a UX lab and because everything was closed. So the tactic instead was I would just kind of go out and find folks. Like if I saw people around, like at a bus stop or at a coffee shop or whatever, and I'd say, hey, do you mind? Can I get your opinion on something? Huh? And then I wouldn't show them my phone. It's like, can you type in this website? I just want to get your feedback. I want to see, you think about this. And I would just do that with strangers. And I'd get this, and I would watch their facial expressions, not their hand. And I would see whether they got confused after asking them about, to do different things. And that really allowed me to know, oh, okay, the font's too small, or, oh, this isn't actually made for thumbs. Oh, okay. Like, so just kind of being willing to slow the process down a bit to get real world feedback, because a lot of the times, we were wrong in like initial concepts. We're like, oh, this will be like the best design. And then in reality, you see that people struggled with it. So yeah, so it was actually over, I think it's probably close to about 500 people.
It's just an incredible number of like a huge amount of feedback, just beyond, I think, way above and beyond sort of like what most folks do.
Yeah, I don't know if I would recommend it. It was like some of this was just like a little insane, but I just really wanted it to work, right? And I wanted it to be like great and not just like the speed kind of was the carrot. But then I was like, okay, like if we're going to make something really fast, let's also make it good. And let's like shoot for, I wouldn't call it perfect. Like there's so many things about this that still I want to fix, but there are, yeah, I think that was just healthy to not stop at, oh, let's just make it fast. Like, let's add these other things to it. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Yeah, I think there's like a few more features to dive in. Somebody asked how you were going to make it 80% faster, which I do want to get to, but not right now. I think there's a few other features I want to sort of dive into first. You said you wanted a navbar when we were chatting beforehand. You said you wanted a navbar optimized for thumbs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, just things like spacing and things like for example, let me go to mobile. But just minimum heights of fields. So because if you don't make it 16 pixels or higher, Apple will automatically get into zoom mode. And so like stuff like that makes it a
Mhm.
frustrating experience on mobile. So making sure that the font size is the right minimum size. And then just that there's enough sufficient spacing around things so that way you can touch it. And like even with these menus and things, just making sure that they're spaced out. The most fun one actually from a thumbs perspective is what we do here. And I know for me, I always like I've learned to actually hate top nav bar. So in future versions of stuff, I'm going to kill it. But I think what I've realized is that a lot of navigation systems on mobile were designed for when our phones were smaller, right? The iPhone, original
Yeah.
iPhone, right, which was like kind of you could do everything with your thumb,
Mhm.
and that was why they designed it that size because you could reach everywhere. But now that our
Mhm.
phones are bigger, right? Like this thing's, like again, it's tethered, so I can't show you. But they're huge. Uh, it's really inconvenient to like reach up to the top. You have to end up using two hands, and
Yeah.
so building for thumbs is really around like this bottom area you can flick up, flick down, and it has different modes. Like if I touch anywhere kind of on this right hand side, not just that link, but like in a large zone, it'll go into like max mode. So there's like small, medium, large, and I can flick up to grow. Like at this point I'm just like doing gestures. So building for thumbs is like gesture support, um, and making sure things have enough margin between them and the
Mhm.
bottom of the phone. Um, what I think in future versions, things that I don't love about this that we'll want to be working on is like things should be draggable too. If you're like building for thumbs,
Yeah.
so right now, even though I'm dragging it right now, but you don't notice, right? It doesn't move
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the
It
phone,
doesn't drag.
so because there's not really like you see that a lot of mobile apps, but on the web, it's really hard to do that. So,
Yeah.
um, trying to figure that one out. But yeah, building for thumbs is like just, I think is a good thesis, right? And it kind of guided the design choices. So whenever people were like, oh, let's add this like floating button, or oh, let's add these like other things, it was like, well, is that good for thumbs? And it was just like a good talking point internally and with the client, right, to kind of think about that, right? Because that if we're trying to convert more mobile visitors, you have to basically design for different size hands and different styles, um, and really stress test stuff. um, so does
Can
that
you
answer
walk?
your question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can you walk a bit through the infinite scroll that you guys built and sort of like the why of that?
Well, I mean, now in the one hand, I mean, it has well, I guess it it changed our page count, because when you do an infinite scroll, you're not actually going to a new page. So
Mhm.
technically, I mean, if we were to replicate exactly what was there before, you have to hit like a next page button. And so, which kind of artificially creates more pages. So we kind of believed, okay, I'd rather not count multiple hits to the search page, because
Mhm.
then it's like you're padding your numbers. So so first it was like the one reason was to make it more accurate, because I didn't want to like have multiple pages attached to just
Can you
flicking through
show sort
multiple
of
cars.
maybe can you show that it might help folks if
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah, sorry, it's just delayed there. Yeah, so in this case, yeah, so this would all be counted as one page view, right,
Mhm.
regardless of how far I go. um
Mhm.
and but just to make that work was was a
But
bit
why
hard.
did you do that as opposed to sort of paginating it?
Oh, well, because again, when we think back to the original goal, right, more leads, which means we
Mhm.
need to have people go to more pages.
Mhm.
But going to multiple pages of this, if you had to flick through pages, is not going to convert
Yeah.
them into a lead. I need them to see cars,
Yeah.
right? And so by removing the button, going to have to go to load more or next. um yeah, it was more difficult to do it this way, but it made the focus around getting to the vehicle, right? So it's
Yeah.
about just like this pursuit of like stripping away stuff that is unnecessary. Like if you don't need it there, you don't
Yeah.
need that button, like get rid of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I love it, and sort of like keeping the visitor sort of engaged with the content that you have on the site. And like in this case, they're looking for a car, and so they want to see more cars, and you want to make it as easy for them as possible to see more cars by making not have to click another button, right? And I think that's great. And then what? Let's see. Can you talk about some of like the yeah. No, go for it.
No, go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
There's just like there's so many cool things in this. I just so yeah, I think there's so talk about dynamic. I had to make a list because I normally don't really think about it, but so I talked about like how the site can change based on UTM, but it also has a bunch of different modes where even though this whole thing is, you know, it's all Gatsby, but we do dynamic rewriting of it. And so as an example, you can have a referral mode, right, which is usbankinginfluence.com, and you can see how this has actually rewritten the homepage.
Yeah.
This is not a static page that was generated. The static page is actually this. It's just because of the URL, we've dynamically rewritten the text. The other thing you'll notice on the site is this, right? If you visit this, I don't know what it says in your case, but if you visit the site, it will actually dynamically detect your area and replace that. And there are different rules around what we say in certain zones, right? And so like if you visit this from Hawaii, they can't ship you a car, so it won't tell you that. And so so there's dynamic rewriting of the text. And in Gatsby world, you can't just rewrite the HTML. You have to rewrite the HTML and the page data JSON and the JavaScript. So we kind of built an engine to rewrite all of them at once when we do a rewrite. And all this is done in the edge in Cloudflare. And so this is like dynamic text, dynamic rewriting of things. And so you can see also you can do dynamic styling, right? You can see here, colors can change. So that's like a feature that, you know, I wouldn't say we heavily use it yet, but it's like built in to like dynamically change the content depending on where you came from and whether we know you. The other thing that's part of it is going back to performance. Well, I mean, that was related to performance because if we didn't do it that way, when you do these other things, these would just take forever to load, right? And so I think using the edge for as much as you can allowed us to not build it into the actual site itself. You're doing it at the network level. The other thing that we did here is privacy first. So you'll notice actually inside, you know, if you want to geek out on this and you want to like look at what's happening behind the scenes, if you actually look at the network request that's going on, there really isn't any other third party in here, right? Except for RudderStack. And so that was also a choice where we're like, even though it was very tempting and still is to just like pop a piece of JavaScript into it from a third party, we had to say no to that, right? And basically find a way to do stuff without just popping in another outside script. And then other kind of cool things that we do with this is around this idea of like, which was unique. In order to make all this work, was a lot of data work too, because go ahead. So you're gonna say something?
No, you go for it.
Like so the way I explain this kind of approach for how to explain Gatsby to like a client or something is like, it's the compiled web, it's the assembled web. Like Jamstack just goes right over folks' head. It's just like, it's too hard to explain. And so and I say like it's the compiled web because we're compiling the site, building the site basically just the same way a mobile app is done, right? The reasons why mobile app is fast is because it's pre-compiled. And so we're just pre-compiling the web, right? So it's the compiled web. And then people go, oh, okay. Like, but they might still not understand it, but at least it's easier to digest. And then so if you're going to do compiled, that means that all the work as much as possible has to be before you compile the site. So stuff like the data that shows up here, even stuff like this, these things like where we highlight various cool things based on rules, that all has to be pre-calculated and we do all that in Sanity. So we run a whole bunch of cleaning, we standardize
Mhm.
stuff, strip out a bunch of weird things, and then calculate the stuff and store it there, so
Yeah.
that when the build step happens, this doesn't have to do any thinking when you visit it. Um, and that was a learning. That was like what took us a lot of time and money to figure out from an R&D perspective. Um,
Yeah.
like how much you
That
had to
this
do
this
before, right?
no, this is super interesting. Like, you essentially clean the data to enable sort of the better filters to enable these kind of like reasons to love. Oh, here's, you can calculate that from the price or like the miles driven on the car or like whatever, and just like thinking through a lot of that and having that done on the data side before, you even start pulling it into the site.
And I wouldn't say this is perfect. Like if you poked around the code, like there's every time I look at it, it's like, oh, there's still a better way to do this. But I think the the way to think about it is whatever you don't do in the data, you have to do with code. Code has to make up for bad data. So if you want to have less code, then you need better data. And so it's basically a choice, and you have to kind of decide per project, right? How much do you want to do on the data side? We decide, like our kind of thing at Touchless is how to help, platforms, agencies, people who operate multiple sites on how to do that more efficiently with less code. And so if in that case, you have to do a lot of it on the data side, right? And so that's just our choice of how to architect stuff. But like, others, maybe that's not the proficiency, so then you have to do it in code. That's fine too. It's just, being willing to know where the trade-off is. Like if you can solve it on the data side, on the source side, I'd recommend it, right? Because then you don't need to have the front end make up for it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this lesson is especially true for any kind of e-commerce site. Whether that's, sort of like what we think about as an e-commerce site, like I'm selling shoes or whatever, or like, this where it's like, well, I'm selling cars, I'm not selling them on the website per se, there's more like lead generation form, and then the sales process happens offline.
Right.
But a lot, but a lot of B2C businesses are like that, right? And so ultimately, you're thinking about, but ultimately you have a feed of data that you're sort of presenting to the visitor, and sort of like showing them to sort of intrigue them. And the more you think about what that data is and how it's structured, and making sure that you have all the relevant information, the better equipped the visitor is to make kind of an
Right.
informed choice about whether this product or service is right for them.
Exactly. And there's a question came in that's like relevant to this too, is like, one of the questions like, where is this hosted and like how's this running? So
Mhm.
yeah, maybe to explain. So everything's on Gatsby Cloud. But with an asterisk on it, we there's a layer above that, which is on Cloudflare. So all traffic goes through Cloudflare. This is what we do typically on kind of all projects. So Cloudflare is kind of the entry, and there's a couple of reasons why that allows us to do dynamic launch as well. So like when we started this project, we didn't actually flip the switch and send everyone to the new site. We started sending people to Gatsby experiences on a per path basis or per region basis. So send 5% of traffic in the Virginia area that went to this like slash used, and then those people will see the Gatsby experience, and the rest will see,
Mhm.
the other. We've also found now I don't need to necessarily do the you don't need to do the percentage based thing, but you can do it. You can actually have a hybrid model where it's like legacy and Gatsby on some stuff, right?
Yeah.
Versus having to do everything. So Cloudflare is like I would call that the core. Is most stuff is done there as much as possible. And then
Mhm.
Gatsby Cloud is used as the build layer. And builds, there was a question on like build time. There was a time I will say there was a time where it took like an hour and a half to build the site, and that was like a lot of
Mhm.
learning. We got it down to now it's usually a couple minutes, and then with Gatsby 5, as we move it into that, it should be in the 15-20 second time frame. Um, but anything else is dynamically rewritten by Cloudflare in real time. So you don't need to do a build to do personalization or to like, oh, urgently we got to change this text or urgently we got to change this photo. We don't need to trigger a build. We can change it on the Cloudflare side and it immediately takes effect. And so
Yeah.
that's why it's like Cloudflare Plus. And then Sanity is the CMS.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because, like, I mean, and the way I'd sort of describe it is like, I mean, I might describe it slightly different, but, using Gatsby for sort of build and hosting, and then having like Cloudflare as like a CDN edge layer, as like an additional sort of edge layer on top where you're doing some of these dynamic, dynamic stuff.
Yeah, and the reason why on that, like, I guess the main lesson out of all of this too is that like we started this thinking, okay, we had to do the full stack. I think in the
mhm,
end we needed to do that to just figure it out. But what we did
mhm,
learn throughout the project is it's possible to do this on top of an existing site. And
yeah,
so you don't actually have to re-platform. You can do it in an iterative way, and you could actually use, especially with Valhalla and stuff, you could use an existing site as a data source, and then you have a Gatsby layer on top that the edge is kind of uh, 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 presenting to the visitor, so they end up
yeah.
never getting to the origin, the original site. They hit the Gatsby, I'll call it the
Yeah.
edge theme, and
And
so, which
and
is
I
kind of
think
cool, right?
for some of our listeners, I think we're starting to get into kind of like what's next territory, in the sense of like this, like
Yeah.
some of the stuff that we're talking about here is sort of like it's sort of the cutting edge, where like we'll have a good case study in like 6 months, and like we'll sort of we'll be able to give kind of more information, like more information about like, hey, how does this like deeply work, probably in few months from now. But I think for now the lesson is kind of like there's some super exciting stuff that, like, in terms of dynamic on the edge, in terms of like, yeah, in terms of saving yourself replatforming, that is kind of cooking, as we're as sort of the we as a platform, and then sort of like pioneers like Kevin are kind of figuring out kind of the patterns, with but to stay tuned on that part. I would say, while we're on the what's next topic, that might be a good point to jump in with Paul's question from earlier, which is like, how do you plan to make the site 80% faster?
Depends on your definition of what it is. So I think there's kind of a couple things. One thing I've learned is that, like, this project took us investing as an R&D kind of partner quite a bit in augmenting the cost of development in order for us to be able to do all the R&D that we did, right? Because it's
Mhm,
not easy to go to someone and say, pay us over $1 million to make something. So, they'll
mhm,
pay X, and then you have to be willing to pay the rest. And so what I learned is that the process of building this took quite a while, right, to figure
mhm,
out. Now we built the site. We actually went from kind of kind of like start the project to live in about 100 days. Um, but we could have done it faster. So, like, there's kind of two levels to that. One is like there's a way of development using this edge
mhm.
type stuff where
Yeah,
you don't need to do as much code. So there's like that part is
yeah,
like, I think the most exciting part I think of the learning of, like, how can you make something like this um faster from like a development standpoint. But then on the
mhm,
experience side of things, what I have learned is, first, as an example, the current site uses style components, which kind of sucks because I mean, sorry, like, style components is great, but for certain scenarios, it's not it's not the best, because what it does is it takes CSS and a whole bunch of stuff and jams it into the JavaScript and makes it part of the kind of time to first paint. And so
yeah,
if you use atomic CSS instead, just little things like that, like switching to, say, a tailwind versus using style components, um, that has made it so it's consistently 100 page speed score on mobile.
interesting.
And so, like, but it's a complete rewrite, right? So we had so changing to atomic CSS,
Yeah,
and the other part is doing more and more on the edge. So we're,
mhm,
especially with like slices and some of the new Gatsby stuff, it's possible to make it so there's just less loaded, right?
Yeah.
Like in certain scenarios, you could even have the page load, the entire package be about 15 kilobits for a dynamic site, which is pretty nuts. So some of
That
that will
is,
take some time to perfect, but
yeah.
there is like there's I guess the answer is there are things that can be done outside of the main code base that if you can do it, it lightens the site itself, right? And so
Yeah.
that's the stuff that like Touchless is kind of like maniacally focused on right now, is like how much can you do outside so that the bundle and everything else remains as light as possible.
Yeah. And this is, I think, where we get into like some, there's for maybe some of the audience, it sort of crosses is sort of
Yeah.
across the line into the mad scientist territory. But like I think it's like
Right.
just super interesting to see kind of like what is that, and I think it's interesting to dive into on each of these aspects, right? Whether it's performance, whether it's like UX and like user flow, whether it's stat, like what is the if we were to optimize that, what would it look like?
Uh,
And I think
and
like, yeah.
and even on that, just to add, like, and I'd say another layer. So there's like there's we talk about faster. There's like how can you build faster? How can you
Mhm.
get this faster without replatforming? There's the actual performance side of it, but then the other part I think
Mhm.
is around navigation. About if we can innovate a better way to do navigation on mobile instead of all these like top bars that people can't reach. If we can make that
Mhm.
more dynamic and interesting,
I'm just thinking
then
about like
then
here's my phone like this
yeah,
like I can't reach that with my thumb where I know hold it
right.
right. My thumbs are like down here.
Right. So imagine if the bottom area was where the action zone was, right? And that's the only place you do action on mobile. But you have to kind of be willing to rethink the entire navigation system entirely, which is like but that's that's kind of the stuff that I'm, obsessive about. But I think the goal is that I think from I think just the underlying thing about this project was what was great about it is they were a great partner. We're and are a great partner in being able to push the boundaries on trying stuff, and they really let us just be willing to take chances and try stuff. And but
Yeah.
it did take a bunch of time from my side to kind of educate, right? Like you have to be willing to
Yeah.
basically educate the client as to why. But I think if you
Mhm.
do that, they'll give you a lot of rope to actually do like the hard stuff instead of just, you know, stopping at, okay, it looks good and you can click through it and let's launch it. Right.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, you guys demonstrated that, incredibly tight connection to business value with sort of, maybe this is a good time to sort of like walk through some of the metrics that we were talking about earlier and just talk about why they're important. But like, when you 7x, if you can 7x conversion, I mean, it's, that's
There's the budget. Yeah. I think what some people struggle with is like, how do you pay for stuff like this, or how do you pay for what's next? And I think if you make something that is good from a business standpoint, the budget is created, right? Like if you now are converting much higher, suddenly you have more budget because you just gave them basically free money, right? Like you gave them more leads, more volume, so that creates budgets for R&D,
I had
ideally,
I,
right?
I had that thought when you were showing the personalization, right? Because what you essentially did, like I didn't even know that you was able to like deliver cars from the US to Canada. Like, you sort of you turn to like a regional car. In some cases, in one case, like that personalization. In some ways, it turned like a regional car dealership into a national, or maybe like a continental car dealership, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
and you could do that with anything that has multiple sites. So like if it's a franchise, if it's somebody with, maybe a really great brand and they're in like Idaho, if you could take their site and rewrite it for each state, all of a sudden that Idaho company is a national company, right? And so it opens up a lot. It's a very good point. Like it opens up a lot of possibilities in being able to service types of customers and regions of customers that you otherwise wouldn't. And also like people don't have the time to write content for each state or city. So by using this, you can really create personalization, but at scale, right?
Yeah.
But also I saw the anonymous, Linear, I've been testing it. I mean, I'm actually eager to, maybe we could trade notes so you could like, ping me. I'm on LinkedIn or whatever, or in the Discord, so feel free to ping me. But I'm eager to, anyone, if anyone finds like really cool performant, components, I'm always eager to share notes on what we found and stuff like that. But
yeah, and for those who didn't get it, this was about the CSS library.
yes.
Linear.
But yeah, I think that the biggest thing out of this, I think none of this would have been possible if it didn't work from a business perspective. And I think sometimes this is where I think the balance is between, the mad scientist stuff and like the trigger for me is the reason why Apple can like completely re-architect their product every year from the inside is because they just make so much cash.
Yeah.
And so good business outcome gives you the budget to do the cool stuff.
Yeah.
And so
I love that. I mean, I'm
right.
I'm on an M1 right now, right? So Apple literally built their own chip, and they sort of invested a huge amount of money in that. I mean, that's
Right.
basically their business was printing money.
So I think for agencies or for clients, like to use this technology, I've been guilty of this in the past, where it's like, you should use it because it's cool, because it's fast, because this person uses it. Like that's kind of what we often will, resort to. But if you make the focus actually on the business outcome at the beginning, then everybody's aligned, and it forces that kind of, mutual investment to get to that result. And that's how I think we are able to scale this to more people, if we can show that like the business impact is incredible, right?
Yeah.
So I think from a learning was like, just it was super cool. So first, like, performance works, right? But if you're going to do performance, right, you have to kind of go all the way with it, if that's going to be your focus. And I mean, for us, like I found that, it was useful. And maybe not everyone can go to the same degree, but
and this actually may be a good sort of transition, which is like, how do you get from sort of an agency that's maybe working on smaller projects with smaller budgets, or like, or a freelancer, whatever your sort of situation is, to where you can like work with this like $3 billion company and like say, like, we're really going to like deep dive into like optimizing this, and then like the project has like a much larger budget. Like what's kind of like the incremental path and the path of adoption that you've seen or found?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think, well, we you'll notice the Touchless is like basically in stealth. So like we've done all this and worked with some pretty cool clients with no website. I don't do any marketing. We don't even like, we're not actually actively looking for clients. We kind of handpick who we want to work with. And so, and we've decided to kind of move into like working with platforms and like other agencies and stuff to kind of help them learn what we learned. But I think from like how we leapt into Coons was just being the person that listens, right? Like the way to get these clients is like, first be where they are, right? Like be where they are, listen to them, talk to them, and learn how to talk, learn how to listen, learn how to make notes, and then go away, do some research, and come back with like, hey, I have an idea. Why don't we try this? And then figure out a way to experiment to prove that it will work, without you having to go and say, trust me with $1 million. That's sometimes maybe a bit of a leap, right?
I think the other
you have to kind of get good at trialing. Right?
I think the other thing that you guys, sort of like an interesting or sort of intriguing approach that we're seeing more of, and this might be something useful if for folks listening, is sort of is sort of like business specific communities, and like the fact that you were hanging out in an auto dealership, kind of like marketing forum, right? And like you're sort of like building some of these things that like, yeah, they generalize to some extent, but a lot of them like a lot of the lessons are very repeatable within a certain sort of like business sector. I think that's like really that's sort of an intriguing approach. I don't know if it works for everybody, but it certainly works for some folks.
Yeah, so yeah, going back to like where they hang out, right? And so each industry always has a hangout, right? If it wasn't an online thing, don't assume that there's always an online place to go. It might mean you actually have to show up at a conference. You might have to go and,
Yeah.
because there usually is some cluster of like, if it's HVAC companies, there's an HVAC conference. If it's insurance companies you want to go after, there's insurance, meetups per state. So one of it is just being aware of where these meetups are. Usually are meetups, and the people who go to them are people who are a bit more open-minded.
Mhm.
So don't even worry about the people who don't go. Just go to the ones where there are people. So that allows you at least to learn, get informed, and then yeah. So I think the main lesson is go to the clusters, but not with an agenda of I'm going to sell these people, right? Because I think especially if you're trying to like get into it, you really just have to be a sponge, right? Because once you are at a point where you actually understand things from their perspective, then you can speak to them in their language. And then you'll have the trust because they're like, oh, they'll realize, oh, okay, you know the terms, right?
Yeah.
You get my pains. And so whereas if you're like typically working with Shopify stores, then want to start doing stuff for banks, like that's a huge leap. And you can do it. You just have to put the time in to learn the lingo and get connected in, right? But there are ways. Like I didn't know the Coons folks over a year ago. I had no
Cool.
connection into them before. So
Yeah. I
but
think this this is a great lesson though, and I know I think we're also I think we're a little bit over time, and I'm which is I didn't actually just notice until now because I'm enjoying this conversation so much. But like I think this is probably a good place to sort of start wrapping it up because I really like the lesson. I really like the lesson of like, ultimately at the end of the day, as a, as someone who's building a website for somebody else, like, the more you live in the world, the more you understand that, the more you can build their website that reflects who they are. And like that, when you build a website that sort of reflects who they are, it's going to have better business outcomes because it's shows the best side of your client.
and I'll just like cap off on like what I found, and it's not to be like I don't want to be like I'm opinionated. I know that, but it's more like just be good, right? Like you get clients by being the best and not settling for being the second best or third best, or you happen to know you hit the publish button. Now look, I made a Gatsby site for the first time. It's like go deeper, like be willing to go and actually learn the craft and not stop at that. And because if you can perfect it, if you can be good, then it'll attract folks, right? And you can then and if no client is willing to do it, make your own, like make your own sandbox, and then you have something to show people, like prove it, basically prove that it works. Right. And so if nobody else is willing to try it yet, you could make it yourself, right?
And I
Just
think
like
that
as
that's
a
a good
sandbox.
way to sort of, as we're closing out, just tie back into performance, right? Because ultimately performance is so demonstratable. Conversion, like you can, UX, you can understand to some extent. Oh wow, this is super intuitive or whatever, but it takes a little bit of time, and nobody can visit a website and know how well it's converting, and it's like very difficult to do that. But like performance, everybody can see it, and that's so like building with Gatsby, and then sort of like, especially if you're able to, sort of like do the kinds of optimizations that Kevin has kind of like described, like that stands out, as an agency, as a freelancer, as a, working inside a company, whatever your role is, that stands out as like high quality, and high quality folks notice high quality other high quality folks.
And yeah, and I think for anyone that's like wants to geek out on this stuff anytime, again, they can always reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm
Mhm.
happy to just, share notes or whatever. And because I think that we also have a responsibility to get this in the hands of as many people as possible, because the alternative sucks for consumers, right? Like, it's inaccessible. You're cutting people out with disabilities from working on the internet. We're hurting all our mobile visitors with sites that take too long to load. So we have like a responsibility, I think, as companies and agencies, et cetera, to like get a better experience, regardless of technology, but get a better visitor experience out to as many people as possible. So like, which is why, like, for what I again, the main thing I learned about this is, with Coons is, yeah, it's great, but I want to do this for like 10,000 sites, not one, right? And so in order to do that, it's like, okay, how do you share this with as many people as possible, so that way we can collectively kind of try and solve this for more people, versus like, me doing a couple projects. So yeah, again, happy to chat with folks, and if, especially if folks can't, like I guess the other part of this is that it to go this far on the performance side did cost money, right? Like, it did cost a bunch of R&D time and money to get to this level. And if that feels scary, there are, like, what I'm learning, that I think is something that we want to do on the touchless side, is like just help folks get that head start, right? Because it just it not everyone can go and do that, right? Especially if you're just getting into this for the first time, right? And anyway, but yeah, this was
That's a
a
great.
fun project to work on, for sure.
Yeah, that's a great place to wrap up. So like, yeah, reach out to Kevin if you're sort of curious for more of the performance deep dive, or if you're trying to, if you're sort of like figuring out how to build this kind of competence into your agency. Thanks for coming. It's great to be here with Kevin. It's good to be here with all of you. Thanks for the questions that you've asked. I'm just gonna thanks for the questions that you've asked along the way. And then, this, like, it's always fun to, really nerd out over whatever part of websites, we get to nerd out over, and we got to nerd out over a few of them today. So thanks for coming. Thanks for nerding out with us. And it's great to be here. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. And we'll chat with you next sometime.
All right, thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.